Hey everyone, hope your Christmas went well. Mine went great. I was actually on stream the whole time doing a new challenge for myself where I build a Roku app basically in under a whole day. I've always wanted to build a Roku app. I have constantly looked at their developer docs every couple years, every so on and often, just because I'm curious to see what I can do with the Roku's OS and see what things and cool features I can do. But I never really looked into it simply because I never really knew what app I could build. I mean, Roku is really used for video and music and all that other stuff. I really wouldn't know what to create besides some sort of basic player, and so anyone else can make that. So for me, that's not really interesting. I did think about doing something with Twitch about 2 or 3 years ago, because when I was looking for a Twitch app on Roku, I didn't see one. So I figured maybe the developers just didn't care or something. That makes sense, but then it puts me back to a position of what am I going to do as far as making an app for Roku? So I thought about it for a bit, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. Video game music. I have been a huge supporter of video game music since the late 90s, where I would go on websites trying to find video game music that was closely related to what I already knew from things like Mega Man and Crash Bandicoot. At the time that I really cared about video game music, it was hard to find MP3 quality video game music, and a lot of times the only things that you could find were MIDIs, which were cool because I actually was into FL Studio at the time, so I could drop in the MIDIs and then kind of switch up the synthesizers and all that stuff, and it felt cool. But it wasn't until a couple years later in the mid 2000s that I really found out about KH Insider and GHFF Shrine. Those are the main places I'm going to go to if I want video game music. And a couple years ago, I had actually created a wrapper out of one of those websites where it basically takes some random MP3 data from that site and basically plays it in a music player. The idea of being like a video game music radio station. And so fast forward to now, I'm thinking that this would be great. I already actually built that website out in multiple different ways. I built it with Python. You can get it open source right now on GitHub. I actually did build that framework out for a client of mine for one of their web apps where it's not playing video game music, but it's actually playing their podcast music for another one of their clients where they deal with a bunch of podcast stuff. So I actually built that same framework for them. And then I also modified that website to see what it is now, where it's actually using Vue.js on the front end and .NET on the back end. And so for me, I was like, for sure, I can be able to move this over to Roku. How hard can it be? And so I first start the speedrun by just downloading Roku's sample files for developers. They have a bunch of different sample files that you can actually deal with. So they have a hello world. I basically side-loaded that into my Roku, and it worked with no problems. However, the first thing that was kind of annoying is that the Roku that I had set up was in the living room, which isn't a big deal, but my Logitech webcam that I had kind of mounted in my living room so that you guys can see the Roku TV had some weird lighting on it, and I couldn't get the right lighting on it, so it didn't look good. So I actually had to stop the stream. I eventually then just decided, you know what, I'm gonna actually move everything from my living room over to the monitor that's actually right behind this camera. Now we're gonna be testing out other sample projects to see what things that we can use for our own projects. There are two that kind of pop out very well to me. The first was like this audio list example. You can essentially see a list of audio files that you can choose and select, and it would play that song. And then there's another one where it is a podcast player. For me, it was a decision between the audio list and the podcast, both of which actually came with their own problems respectively. You see, the audio list was good, but it doesn't actually play anything from direct audio, and it didn't move to the next track. This means that I would have to figure out logic on how to be able to move from one song to another song if I was going to use that project as my first base template. Another big issue is that the information that was being pulled in is from an XML file. Inside the XML file was a list of MP3s, and so I would need to know how to be able to actually play an MP3 file from a URL. As far as the audio player test, well, that one seemed really good, but that one came with the problem of being an RSS feed podcast player. This means that I'd have to actually feed in some sort of RSS feed in order for that player to work. So for the next hour to 2 hours, I start messing with things. I start changing around elements. One of the major differences when dealing with Roku is that they have their own proprietary language, with BrightScript being JavaScript and Scene Graph being your XML, HTML, component, template, graphics. And as I'm learning about this proprietary language, I start trying to multitask as well. I know that I need to have MP3 music for my player, and since I already have a web app with that music, my main goal is to see how I can be able to access that. Do I have a database for that stuff already? Do I have an API for it? Honestly, I don't remember. I do so many projects, I genuinely don't remember, and the last time I had worked on that project in full detail was almost a year ago. So for me, I had no clue, and I needed to kind of multitask where my data is coming from, where my database is really coming from, so I could be able to know if I need to make an API call to it, if I'm going to add a SQLite 3 file to my project. So after messing around with a bit, I find out that I was using SQLite 3 for my database for my web app that already has the video game music, which is fine, because I also found out that I have an API that I can be able to access as well from there. So this is great. I already have an API, and all I would need to do is call that API, and it's going to randomly generate out an MP3 song for me, along with track information, artist information, the year the game came out, all that stuff. Now for me, it's about testing out playing an MP3. And so once I found the right information and found the right way to be able to apply a URL for an MP3 to the audio, I was in a really good position, because for me, I felt that I was way ahead of time. I'm super happy. I'm like, all I need to do is just fetch from my API, and that should be it. Besides, this is BrightScript or whatever it's called, right? That's the same as JavaScript, right? So surely I'm not going to run across an issue with just getting an API, because APIs for me are like bread and butter. It should be extremely easy, especially because it's my own API. It's not like I'm asking someone else, right? So this this was the hope. And so I first start testing out how to be able to get an API call to work in the first place. The first thing I would think is just make a fetch request, but that's not going to genuinely work. You have to use specific functions that Roku gives you for BrightScript in order to actually do specific calls and certain things in X, Y, and Z for especially AJAX or fetch type requests. The first issue that I ran across is that I would try to make the API call in the, let's say, the main entry point, or what they would call the main.brs file. And I would try to call it in from there to see then if I could like use that as a constant function that I could be able to reoccurringly call. So when I tried it from there, it wouldn't output anything onto Roku. And it turns out when you're doing API calls, or just doing fetch recalls, or just doing calls in general from some other source, you can't have it in your main thread, I assume, or the main BRS file. You can have things in there for things on startup that you want to load immediately on startup, but if you want them to load later once the screen is loaded and everything like that, you're not going to be able to do that there. ChatGPT had told me that in order to work around that I need to create what's called a task. This task can be, I guess, on another thread, where I can then be able to use that task and get the information from that. I tried doing that for about an hour to 2 hours. It doesn't work. I'm getting frustrated. I have no clue why it's not working. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to take a step back. So I decided I was going to take a project that already exists and see if I can modify that. And I also had then decided, you know what, instead of trying to always ding my API, let's try to ding something else. And then also let's try to ding my API from something else in general. Like, let's just change up everything. And after setting up the test project, I found the first issue. Roku requires that you have SSL certs added to your project and in your code to be used when you're doing an API call for something that is HTTPS. Now, why they have you do this, I have no clue. Like, in reality, I know why normally for anything that isn't Roku, this makes sense. If I had, let's say, an EC2 instance on AWS and I had a web server and I needed HTTPS, this makes sense. But through an app like Roku, that to me was super weird. Not also that, the certs that they say that you can use that comes from like the Roku developers that you can download and they say to use with your project wasn't working for me. I'm starting to look around and I find that there are these two options that let me bypass this. You can use something called enable peer verification and set it to false, and also enable host verification and set that to false. And if you do that, it will basically override the need for any certs or HTTPS or HTTP. It'll just work. Now, everyone online says that's insecure. I understand. Technically, I do not care because this is a speed run. And if I actually cared about fully fleshing out it to make it perfect and people like the app, then yeah, I'll go back to that. But that's stopping me from moving any forward, and I had no clue what was going on, even though, again, I added those certs to the project like they asked for. So because of that, I'm using this. That's what we're gonna do. So I test my API, and that one doesn't work. But we just tested the other JSON placeholder fake API, and that one was working. And so now we have a different situation where we knew that there was one issue going on, we resolved it, but we're still having some issue with just my API. And that's where we get into more troubleshooting, more going down into rabbit holes, more testing. And one of the things that was extremely annoying about troubleshooting this is that it didn't give an error. Normally, for any other API, or if I'm trying to get request information or whatever, all I have to do is take a look at the status code and be fine. However, this function that I was using to be able to call out for my API doesn't give you back all the information from the request. It only actually gives you back the body. So you don't know anything on the status information. So I had to do research on this and do some checking with ChatGPT. And there is another function that I can use where essentially, instead of doing like a post to string function, there is an async version of this. And this async version actually stores the whole request information onto the Roku. So after the actual API is called, I can read from the Roku's device and actually get that information to know what's going on. So just to be able to find out the error of what's going on, I had to refactor that function just to make it asynchronous, where I can then read that information. And after doing that, I was able to find out that the error that I was receiving is a 415, which is a media type error. Now, this was extremely helpful for me because normally if I deal with a 415, I know that it's something as far as a bad request of the information I'm sending my API. The hard part about this though is that I had just did the same basic information send in Python and it works. So the fact that I know that the actual API is working when I craft out the information, and yet it's not working on the Roku device, well, that's super weird. And after doing constant tests against Python directly, and then also doing testing directly on BrightScript, I found out that the issue is that even though BrightScript is like JavaScript, they don't have something called null or a none, which would be in Python. Instead, they have something called invalid, and that would be the same equivalent. So I needed to use that to actually send over my information. And so after dealing with that, which took like about most of the time of doing this, 4, 5, 6 hours, most of that time, now we're back on track. Now I want to go ahead and plug in, play, pause, and seeing if I can go to the next track. And I got that done in about 40 minutes. It was actually quite simple to do. It cost me about another 40 minutes to update the information on the screen with the API information as far as the author, the year, the genre of the video game, all that other stuff. So basically within about 2 hours, right after dealing with that API, I got basically everything working. Now all we have to do is basically get it ready to be pushed to the Roku store and put it up on GitHub. I've never pushed anything to the Roku store, so I wasn't really sure or prepared as to what was going on, but it's essentially the same as Google. You have to be able to fill out a certain amount of things, you have to confirm a certain amount of things, you have to give a URL for your terms of service, your privacy policy, your app has to have an image, and that image needs to have a certain amount of resolution, those type of things. So the first thing I do is I format my image out so that it can work on the Roku app. Once I do that, then we're going through the developer checklist that Roku gives you when you're on the developer dashboard and you're trying to add an app to the store. There was one issue, however, though, that I was so pissed with. It basically took me the rest of the time to deal with. There is something within the checklist process called deep links, where they needed to have something in my code that is able to link let's say a song or some sort of element to a URL, right? So therefore, like, I guess for metadata purposes, you know, my app or the elements there can be associated with wherever they're actually coming from, like whatever website. I actually don't understand it, because the main thing is I don't have anything that requires this. I don't have any real content that needs this deep linking, because there would never be a time where I would let someone just connect directly to my audio file in Roku. And essentially I came up with an idea that ChatGPT was able to do for me, where I was able to integrate it. And I just said, hey, look, if it needs some sort of ID, content ID with deep linking and all this other stuff, why don't we just make it so that anytime we get an API and the data comes in and we get a new MP3, that we then generate a mock-up fake content ID that we can then use for this deep linking, so to speak. So therefore I can have this deep fake linking added into the code. The static code analysis tool that Roku uses will see that, and then from there it'll accept, which it did. It accepted it, and I was able to get past that. And I finished in under 12 hours. And I'll tell you right now, most of that time was literally going down rabbit holes of things that I thought would have been easy for me to do. And turns out, because of some odd quirk or X, Y, and Z, that it turned out to spread into hours and hours. And so it helps me to know for any of these other future speedruns to try my best to try to find out what will be a rabbit hole before I even begin. Instead of me spending hours and hours and hours on a rabbit hole, I could hope to try to find that. But to be honest, that's kind of what computer programming is. That's what problem solving in tech is. I mean, if you're not dealing with rabbit holes like this, you must have a really lucky job in tech. Because at the end of the day, the most valuable aspect of what I do and everything that I love about it is getting into those rabbit holes and figuring out what's really going on. And even though it may be frustrating in the moments, it's a rewarding feeling when it comes to the whole grand scheme of things. And who knows, maybe we can actually make this app better and actually make it something that goes viral and people actually like. But for now, I hope the rest of your day goes well, everyone, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.